I have spent 11 years archiving treaties for the Concord's diplomatic registry, and in all that time, no document crossed my desk with the reputation of the Ashwell Accord. Every first-year cadet in the registry is made to read it. Every diplomatic academy on every Concord world teaches it as the finest piece of containment law ever written. The document that ended the human compliance war 200 years ago and folded the most volatile species the galaxy had ever produced into permanent, manageable submission. It was, by every account I had ever heard, humanity's unconditional surrender. So when the Bicentennial Commission asked me to prepare the formal annotated edition of the Accord for the anniversary gala, I treated it the way I treated every assignment, as routine. My name is Vessa Korr, and my job has never been to interpret history. My job is to catalog it, to trace the lineage of a clause back to its origin, to confirm dates and signatories, and make sure the record is precise enough to survive scrutiny. I had no reason to expect the Ashwell Accord would be any different from the 400 other treaties I had annotated in my career. I remember the exact moment I stopped believing that. It was on the 9th page, in a section titled Provisional Administrative Allowances, Section 14C, a clause so dry and procedural that generations of scholars had apparently skimmed past it without comment. It granted the defeated human government limited self-administration over 11 designated reconstruction zones, territories deemed too damaged by the war to be worth direct Concord oversight. The language was almost apologetic in tone, as though the Concord negotiators had been doing humanity a favor by not bothering to manage worthless, ruined land. I cross-referenced the 11 zones out of habit, the same reflexive verification I performed on every geographic reference in every treaty, and I found that not one of those 11 zones had ever appeared in a single Concord damage assessment from the war. Not one. According to our own military records, none of those systems had seen combat in the final 2 years of the conflict at all. I told myself it was a clerical inconsistency. Wartime records were notoriously imperfect. I made a note in the margin and continued reading. By page 30, I had stopped believing it was a coincidence. The pattern repeated itself throughout the entire document, disguised inside language so bureaucratically unremarkable that I understood immediately why 2 centuries of scholars had missed it. Every single concession the Concord had granted humanity in defeat. Every allowance framed as pity, as leniency toward a broken and humiliated species, mapped precisely onto capabilities no defeated civilization should have wanted, let alone requested. A clause permitting limited orbital debris management infrastructure for reconstruction zones was, on paper, humanitarian cleanup equipment. Cross-referenced against later manifests, the same equipment classification had been used, decades afterward, in the construction of shipyards, 3 times the size anything in the treaty should have permitted. A clause allowing humanity to retain cultural preservation vessels to relocate historical artifacts away from combat zones had specified tonnage and drive capacity almost identical to Concord military transport standards of the era. A clause granting Earth continued authority over its own agricultural distribution logistics had, buried in an appendix no one had apparently cross-indexed in 200 years, included provisions for independent long-range communication, relays justified as coordination equipment for distributed farming colonies. None of it, taken individually, looked like anything but the routine administrative debris of post-war bureaucracy. Together, read in sequence, cross-referenced against what those allowances had actually become over 2 centuries, it read like something else entirely. It read like a species that had lost a war negotiating, clause by dull, forgettable clause, for exactly the infrastructure it would need to never lose one again. I did not sleep well that night. I told myself it was fatigue, that I had been staring at legal language for too many consecutive hours, and had begun seeing patterns where none existed, the way tired eyes find faces in static. I nearly deleted my notes the following morning. What stopped me was a name I found on the original signatory page, listed among the Concord's negotiating delegation from 200 years earlier, a name that still, improbably, appeared in the registry's active personnel directory. Ambassador Renaud Fidal, 231 years old, Vandari, still listed as a consulting emeritus to the diplomatic registry, technically still employed, though I had never once seen her in the building. I requested a meeting through official channels and was told politely that Ambassador Ofidal did not accept unscheduled correspondence. I sent the request anyway, attaching only the treaty's original document number and Section 14C. Her reply came within the hour, 4 words long. "You finally noticed it." She agreed to see me the following day in a private research annex on the registry's lowest level, a place I had not known existed until her assistant directed me there. Ofidal was smaller than I expected, folded into an old chair surrounded by physical documents. Actual printed paper, a rarity in an era when everything of consequence lived in searchable archives. She did not look up when I entered. "You found the reconstruction zones," she said. It was not a question. "I found a lot of things I don't understand," I said. "I was hoping you could explain them." She finally looked at me, and there was something in her expression I recognized instantly, because I had felt it myself for the last 2 days. Not surprise. Exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been waiting a very long time for someone else to catch up to a conclusion they reached decades earlier. "I was on the negotiating team," she said. "Junior staff. I drafted 11 of those clauses myself under instruction from delegates far more senior than I was, who assured me the language was standard post-war humanitarian boilerplate. I believed them. For 30 years, I believed them." She reached for a folder on the table beside her and slid it toward me. Inside were pages of her own handwritten annotations, dated across decades, tracking the same pattern I had found in 2 days across a career she had spent an entire lifetime confirming. It took me until I was nearly 60 to understand what we had actually signed. By then it was far too late to do anything about it, and far too dangerous to say anything out loud. Dangerous how? Because the moment you understand what that treaty actually did, she said, you also understand that the war was never won. It was concluded. On terms the losing side wrote for itself in language so unremarkable that the winning side never bothered to read it twice. I did not want to believe her. I told myself that a 200-year-old woman, alone in a basement archive surrounded by paper, was exactly the kind of source the registry trained its analysts to be skeptical of. But when I asked her why, if she was right, no one had ever raised the alarm. She gave me an answer that has not left me since. "Because every individual clause is defensible," she said. "Every individual concession has a plausible humanitarian justification you can point to without embarrassment. It is only the pattern, across 200 years cross-referenced against outcomes no one thought to track, that becomes impossible to explain as coincidence. Humans did not write a treaty of surrender, Vessa. They wrote a treaty of patience, and it has had 2 centuries to mature." I left the annex with her folder and spent the following week doing what I do best, verifying. I pulled construction records, colonial charter amendments, technology transfer logs, communication infrastructure permits, cross-referencing every allowance in the Ashwell Accord against what those 11 reconstruction zones had actually become over 2 centuries of quiet, unremarkable development. I expected at some point to find the pattern break down, to find a reasonable, boring explanation that would let me file this away as an old woman's fixation and return to my actual assignment. The pattern did not break down. It deepened. By the time I filed my findings with the registry's oversight committee, I had documented 41 individual clauses across the Accord's appendices, each one framed as a minor post-war concession, each one mapping with uncomfortable precision onto infrastructure, resource access, or technological capacity that a genuinely defeated, genuinely contained species should never have been permitted to retain. I recommended, cautiously, that the Bicentennial Commission delay the anniversary gala pending further review. The response I received back was not from the Commission. It was from a newly convened oversight body I had never heard mentioned before. Assembled, I would later learn, within 48 hours of my report reaching senior registry leadership, my clearance was upgraded without explanation. I was reassigned, effective immediately, to a small interagency task force operating under a designation so new it did not yet appear in any organizational directory. The first thing the task force did was pull satellite survey data on all 11 reconstruction zones, current as of the past year. What we found sat in the briefing room for a long silent minute before anyone spoke. Every zone had grown. Not modestly, not within the bounds of anything the Accord's original allowances should have permitted, but substantially, consistently over 2 centuries in careful lockstep with clauses everyone had read 1,000 times and understood 1,000 times incorrectly. Shipyards where the treaty specified orbital debris management. Independent communication networks spanning entire sectors where the treaty specified agricultural coordination relays. Population centers, self-governing, self-sufficient, entirely outside any Concord oversight framework, existing under the quiet legal shelter of language 200 years old that no one had ever bothered to challenge, because challenging it would have meant admitting the Concord's own negotiators had been outmaneuvered by a species everyone assumed had been begging for mercy. The task force lead, a methodical Farai administrator named Tellis O'Conway, put it more plainly than anyone else dared to during that first briefing. "We did not defeat humanity 200 years ago," he said, staring at the survey data. "We handed them 200 years of legal cover to prepare for whatever comes next, and we signed our own names to the paperwork that made it possible." I was assigned, given my role in surfacing the pattern, to accompany a small verification team to Reconstruction Zone 9, the largest and least documented of the 11, ostensibly a devastated agricultural colony, too damaged by wartime bombardment to warrant Concord administrative interest. Our official cover story, approved at the highest levels, was a routine bicentennial infrastructure survey, the kind of dull procedural visit that would raise no alarm and require no special authorization under the treaty's own terms. We arrived expecting ruins, the scarred remains of a colony left to rebuild slowly under humanitarian allowance. What we found instead was a functioning, sophisticated settlement. Its technology quietly advanced beyond anything in the Concord's official assessment of human capability, its population going about ordinary lives with the calm, unbothered ease of people who had never once considered themselves defeated. There was no defensiveness in how they moved through their own streets, no visible fear of the Concord survey team walking among them, only a kind of patient, watchful courtesy, as though they had always known this visit would eventually come and had long ago decided exactly how they intended to handle it. We were escorted, without incident, to a regional administrative office by officials who introduced themselves with unfailing politeness and answered every question within the narrow bounds the Accord technically permitted them to answer, and not one word beyond it. I understood, watching them, that Ophidal had been right about something else as well. This was not a population hiding from scrutiny. This was a population that had spent 2 centuries becoming fluent in exactly how much scrutiny the treaty legally allowed, and giving precisely that much and no more. It was on our second day in the zone that the incident occurred which the task force's final report would later describe, with careful bureaucratic understatement, as an unauthorized data retrieval attempt. One of our verification technicians, eager for clearer readings on the settlement's independent communication array, deployed a small survey drone slightly beyond the boundary our hosts had quietly indicated we should not cross. The drone transmitted for 11 seconds before its feed cut cleanly to static. When we inquired, our human liaison, a calm, unhurried administrator named Director Priya Anand, informed us with unbothered courtesy that the device had entered a restricted agricultural monitoring corridor and had been recovered for return upon our departure, and that she would appreciate it if future surveys respected the zone's clearly marked boundaries, as specified, she noted with the faintest trace of something that was not quite a smile, in Section 14C, subsection 9, of the Ashwell Accord itself. No wreckage was ever produced, no explanation beyond that offered. The drone was returned to us, intact, powered down, its storage core wiped clean of everything except a single embedded text file, left deliberately for us to find. It read only, "You are welcome to ask us directly. We have always been willing to answer honest questions." I understood, reading that message, exactly what Ophidal had meant about a species that had spent 200 years becoming patient rather than desperate. They were not hiding because they were weak. They were controlling access because they had learned, across 2 centuries of careful legal discipline, exactly how much the galaxy was capable of misreading, even when shown the truth plainly. Our final day in the zone, Director Anand requested a formal meeting with Administrator O'Conway, myself, and the 2 other senior members of our team. held in a modest civic building that could have belonged to any unremarkable municipal government anywhere in Concord space. She was not accompanied by military escort. She did not need to be. "I understand the Bicentennial Commission has questions about our treaty," she said. Once we were seated, her tone carrying the same unhurried courtesy she had shown throughout our entire visit. "I would be glad to answer them plainly, if that would help." Okonwe, to his credit, did not waste time with diplomatic circling. Was the Ashwell Accord written to allow humanity to rebuild military and industrial capacity under legal cover the Concord never intended to grant? Director Anand considered the question with the unhurried patience of someone who had clearly expected it decades before it was ever asked. The Concord's negotiators believed they were dictating terms to a defeated species too broken to negotiate meaningfully, she said. "Our negotiators understood that a treaty is only as strong as the attention paid to its language, and that attention across 2 centuries is a resource every civilization eventually runs short of. We did not deceive anyone about what the clauses said. We simply trusted correctly that no one would read them twice. And if we had?" I asked, surprising myself by speaking at all in a room clearly reserved for people with greater authority than mine. She turned her attention to me fully, and for the first time since our arrival, something in her expression softened into what might have been genuine respect. "Then we would have negotiated the same outcome through slower, harder means," she said. "But you didn't, and we are grateful we did not have to. We hold no anger toward the Concord for this, Analyst Korr. 200 years ago, you offered us a choice between annihilation and terms we could survive. We chose survival, and we chose to survive on our own future terms rather than the ones you believed you were granting us. That is not deception. That is simply patience, applied for longer than anyone thought a species like ours was capable of sustaining." "What happens now?" Okonwe asked quietly. Director Anand's answer was calm, measured, and carried none of the triumph the moment might have justified. "Now," she said, "the Concord has a choice of its own to make. It can treat this discovery as a violation requiring correction, which I would gently caution against, given what 2 centuries of careful preparation actually represents in practical terms. Or it can recognize that the treaty it signed 200 years ago no longer describes a defeated species awaiting supervision, but a sovereign one that has simply, patiently, been waiting for someone to finally read the paperwork correctly." We returned to Concord space 3 days later, and the report I filed bore almost no resemblance to the routine bicentennial annotation I had originally been assigned to write. I documented, as precisely as the registry always required, the true architecture of the Ashwell Accord, not a treaty of surrender, but a treaty of controlled, patient, legally immaculate preparation, honored to the letter for 200 years by a species that had understood, long before the ink dried, that the galaxy's attention was the only defense it would ever truly need to outlast. The Bicentennial Commission canceled the anniversary gala within a week of receiving my findings. No public statement was ever issued explaining why. I understand now that there will likely never be one, because there is no way to announce that the finest piece of containment law in Concord history was, from its very first clause, something else entirely, without admitting that the species everyone believed had been humbled into submission had instead spent 2 centuries teaching the rest of the galaxy an uncomfortable lesson about the difference between winning a war and simply being patient enough to lose one on your own terms. I still have Ophidahl's folder on my desk, her decades of quiet, solitary annotation finally validated by a treaty 200 years overdue for an honest reading. I think of her often, of the particular exhaustion in her voice when she told me I had finally noticed. I understand now what she meant. The galaxy had 200 years to read the Ashwell Accord correctly, clause by dull, forgettable clause. Humanity was never counting on us to miss it forever. They were only ever counting on us to take long enough to matter.